My name is Robert Sullivan, and for 22 years I've been running charter fishing trips out of Grand Isle, Louisiana, taking clients to some of the most productive fishing grounds in the Gulf of Mexico. I've navigated around hurricanes, dealt with equipment failures, and handled every kind of emergency these waters can throw at you. But nothing in 2 decades of charter fishing prepared me for what happened on July 18th, when I ignored an old Cajun fisherman's warning about Platform Echo 7 and discovered something that powerful people would kill to keep secret. The day started like hundreds of others at my dock on Grand Isle. The Fishing Fool, my 42-foot charter boat, was loaded with fuel, ice, and tackle for a full-day trip with 4 clients from Houston who wanted to target red snapper and king mackerel in the deeper waters south of the Louisiana coast. My crew for this trip consisted of Tommy Boudreau, a 28-year-old Cajun who'd been working boats in these waters since he was 16, and Maria Santos, a 34-year-old marine biology graduate who joined us 6 months earlier as both crew member and scientific observer for various research projects. "Weather's perfect," Tommy reported as we prepared to cast off at 5:30 a.m. "Light winds, calm seas, and the fish have been biting good all week." Our clients were experienced anglers who'd fished with me before. Jack Morrison, a Houston oil executive, Dr. Patricia Williams, a marine veterinarian, her husband David Williams, a retired Coast Guard officer, and their teenage son Kevin, who was hoping to catch his first large pelagic fish. "Where are we heading today, Captain?" Jack asked as we cleared the harbor entrance and began our run to the fishing grounds. "About 35 miles southeast," I replied, setting our course for a productive area around several active oil platforms. The snapper have been holding good around the rigs, and there's been some nice kings moving through the area. The run to our fishing grounds took us through some of the most industrialized waters in the world. The Gulf of Mexico contains thousands of oil and gas platforms, creating artificial reefs that attract baitfish and, consequently, the game fish that feed on them. For charter boat captains, the platforms are navigation landmarks and productive fishing spots. But as we approached our target area, we encountered old Pierre Thibodeau, a 73-year-old Cajun fisherman who'd been working these waters since before most of the platforms were built. Pierre was anchored near Platform Echo 7, a structure that had been abandoned 5 years earlier when the well beneath it was depleted. "Bobby," Pierre called out as we passed within hailing distance. "You stay away from that platform, you hear me?" Pierre's warning was unusual. He'd never given me specific advice about where to fish or not to fish, and his tone carried an urgency that made me reduce throttle and move closer to his boat. "What's wrong with Echo 7? I asked, noting that the platform looked the same as dozens of others we passed regularly. "Something ain't right about that place," Pierre replied, his weathered face serious. "Fish been acting strange around there and I seen things. Well, just stay away, that's all." Pierre was known throughout the fishing community as someone who understood Gulf waters better than most marine biologists. His family had been fishing these waters for 4 generations, and his knowledge of fish behavior, weather patterns, and underwater topography was legendary among local fishermen. "What kind of things?" I pressed, curious about what could have spooked such an experienced fisherman. "Dead fish," Pierre said quietly. "Lots of dead fish floating up from deep water around that platform. And they don't look like they died natural, if you know what I mean." Before I could ask for more details, Pierre started his engine and headed away from Echo 7, leaving me with more questions than answers about what might be wrong with the abandoned platform. "What was that about?" Jack Morrison asked as we continued toward our planned fishing area. "Probably just superstition," I replied, though Pierre's warning bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Old fishermen sometimes get strange ideas about certain areas. But as we began fishing around the active platforms near our target coordinates, I found myself thinking about Pierre's warning and glancing toward Echo 7, which was visible about 2 miles to the east. The abandoned platform looked no different from dozens of others I'd fished around for years, but something about Pierre's concern made me uneasy. The fishing was excellent around the active platforms. We caught red snapper, king mackerel, and several species of smaller fish, keeping our clients busy and happy throughout the morning. By noon, we'd caught enough fish to make the trip a success, and the clients were discussing whether to head back early or continue fishing. "Let's try that abandoned platform," Jack suggested, pointing toward Echo 7. "Sometimes the fish concentrate around the structures that don't have boat traffic." The suggestion made sense from a fishing perspective. Abandoned platforms often held large fish because they received less fishing pressure than active installations. But Pierre's warning echoed in my mind, along with his mention of dead fish and unnatural behavior. "There are plenty of good spots around the active platforms," I replied, trying to steer the conversation away from Echo 7. "Come on, Captain," Dr. Williams interjected. "We've got time," and that old fisherman was probably just being territorial about his favorite spot. The pressure from clients who were paying good money for the trip was hard to resist, especially when their reasoning seemed logical. Echo 7 was an abandoned platform in public waters, and I had every right to fish there. Pierre's warning might have been nothing more than an old fisherman's attempt to keep other people away from productive fishing. At 1:15 p.m., I made the decision that would change everything we thought we understood about abandoned oil platforms and the secrets they might hide. "All right," I said, turning the fishing fool toward Echo 7. "We'll try the abandoned platform for an hour or two." The approach to Echo 7 took us through water that seemed normal in every way. The sea conditions were calm, the water color was typical for the area, and our electronics showed fish marks around the platform's submerged structure. Nothing suggested that this location was any different from dozens of other platforms we'd fished. But as we got closer to Echo 7, Maria noticed something that made her grab my arm and point toward the water around the platform's base. "Captain, look at the water color," she said, her voice tight with concern. "There's something wrong with it." What I saw made me immediately reduce our speed and switch the engines to neutral. The water around Echo 7 had a subtle but unmistakable discoloration, a slightly oily sheen that extended in a rough circle about 200 yards from the platform's base. "Is that oil?" Tommy asked, joining us at the rail to observe the water conditions. "Looks like it," I replied, though the sheen was unlike any surface oil I'd seen from normal platform operations. "But this platform's supposed to be capped and abandoned." Maria began taking water samples using equipment she carried for her research projects, while I used our fish finder to examine the bottom structure around the platform. What the sonar showed was disturbing. The seafloor around Echo 7 appeared to be covered with what looked like a thick layer of debris or sediment that wasn't present around other platforms. "The bottom profile is all wrong," I reported to the group. "There's something covering the seafloor that shouldn't be there." But the real discovery came when Kevin Williams, the teenage son of our clients, spotted something floating in the discolored water that made all of us realize we were looking at more than just routine platform maintenance issues. "Captain, there's something over there," Kevin called out, pointing toward a dark object bobbing in the oily water about 50 yards from our boat. What we pulled from the water was a dead red snapper, but not one that had died from normal causes. The fish showed signs of severe chemical exposure: burned fins, damaged gills, and lesions on its skin that indicated contact with highly toxic substances. "This fish has been poisoned," Dr. Williams said after examining the specimen. "The tissue damage is consistent with exposure to industrial chemicals, probably petroleum-based compounds." Maria collected tissue samples from the dead fish while I used our GPS to mark the exact coordinates of Echo 7 and document the water conditions we were observing. Whatever was happening around this abandoned platform, it was serious enough to require official investigation. "Should we report this to the Coast Guard?" Tommy asked, recognizing the implications of finding evidence of pollution around an oil platform. "Absolutely," I replied, reaching for our radio to contact the Coast Guard station in New Orleans. "This looks like a major environmental incident." But before I could make the radio call, we were approached by a vessel that would complicate our discovery in ways we couldn't have anticipated. A 65-foot crew boat with corporate markings was heading directly toward us at high speed, and something about its aggressive approach suggested that our presence at Echo 7 was neither welcome nor unexpected. "Charter vessel, this is Titan Marine Services," came the radio call from the approaching boat. "You are in a restricted area and need to move away from that platform immediately." The claim that we were in restricted waters was puzzling, since Echo 7 was supposed to be an abandoned platform in public waters. But the tone of the radio communication and the speed of the crew boat's approach suggested that we'd stumbled into something more serious than routine environmental violations. "This is Captain Sullivan aboard the Fishing Fool," I replied. "We're in public waters conducting legal fishing activities. What's the nature of the restriction?" "Move away from the platform now," came the repeated order, without any explanation of legal authority or specific restrictions. As the crew boat closed to within 100 yards of our position, I could see at least 6 men on its deck, including several who appeared to be armed security personnel rather than routine platform maintenance workers. "We need to go," I told my crew and clients, recognizing that we were facing a situation that went far beyond environmental violations or fishing regulations. But as I started our engines to leave the area, Maria made a discovery that would ensure our involvement in whatever was happening at Echo 7 was far from over. "Captain, look at this," she said, holding up a water sample that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence that definitely wasn't natural. This isn't just oil pollution. There's something else in this water, something that shouldn't exist in nature. We were leaving Echo 7 as ordered, but we were taking with us evidence of something that powerful interests clearly wanted to keep hidden. Old Pierre's warning had been more accurate than any of us had realized, and our decision to ignore it had put us in the middle of a conspiracy that reached far beyond abandoned oil platforms. The confrontation with the Titan Marine Services crew boat was brief but intense. As we moved away from Echo 7 under their watchful escort, I noticed several disturbing details that confirmed we'd stumbled into something far more serious than routine environmental violations. The crew boat was equipped with sophisticated communications equipment, far beyond what was needed for platform maintenance. The men on deck were armed with weapons that seemed inappropriate for industrial workers. Most telling, they maintained a protective formation around Echo 7 that suggested they were guarding the platform rather than simply conducting repairs. "Those aren't maintenance workers," David Williams observed, his Coast Guard experience helping him recognize the tactical positioning of the security team. "That's a military-style protection detail." As we headed back toward Grand Isle, I kept monitoring our radio for any official Coast Guard communications about restricted waters around Echo 7. There were none. According to all official sources, the platform was abandoned and the surrounding waters were open to public use. "So who gave those guys authority to order us away?" Tommy asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. "Nobody official," I replied, which meant we'd encountered a private security operation with no legal authority to restrict access to public waters. But the real significance of our discovery became apparent when Maria began analyzing the water samples and fish tissue we'd collected. Using portable testing equipment she carried for her research, she was able to identify chemical compounds that shouldn't have existed in Gulf waters. "This is incredible," she said, studying her test results. "The water samples contain synthetic organic compounds that are used in experimental petrochemical processes. These chemicals aren't produced by any routine oil refining operations." The implications were staggering. If Maria's analysis was correct, someone was using Echo 7 for illegal dumping of experimental chemicals, probably toxic waste from research and development operations that couldn't be disposed of through normal channels. "How dangerous are these chemicals?" Dr. Williams asked, examining Maria's data with the expertise of a marine veterinarian who understood toxic exposure in aquatic environments. "Extremely dangerous," Maria replied. "These compounds are designed to break down organic materials, which is why the fish we found showed such severe tissue damage. If these chemicals are being dumped in significant quantities, they could devastate the entire marine ecosystem in this area." As we continued toward port, I tried to piece together what we'd discovered. Echo 7 was supposed to be an abandoned platform, but it was clearly being used for something that required armed security and produced toxic waste that was killing marine life. The financial implications were enormous. Companies involved in illegal chemical dumping faced fines and penalties that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars, not to mention the criminal liability for environmental crimes. The stakes were high enough to explain why armed security was protecting the platform. "We need to report this to the EPA and the Coast Guard," I decided. "This is way beyond anything we can handle ourselves." But as we approached Grand Isle, we encountered evidence that our discovery at Echo 7 had already attracted attention from people who wanted to prevent any official investigation. 3 black SUVs with government license plates were parked at the marina where we normally docked, and several men in business suits were questioning other fishermen about our activities. The scene looked more like a federal investigation than routine environmental enforcement. "Something's not right," Tommy observed as we approached our usual slip. "Those guys don't look like EPA inspectors." I decided to dock at a different marina, one where we weren't expected and where we might be able to unload our evidence without attracting attention. But as we changed course, my cell phone began ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. "Captain Sullivan, this is Special Agent Morrison with the FBI," said the caller when I answered. "We need to speak with you about your activities near Platform Echo 7 today." The FBI involvement confirmed that we discovered something with national security implications, not just environmental violations. But it also meant that we were now part of a federal investigation that could be extremely dangerous for everyone involved. "We're heading back to port," I told Agent Morrison. "We'll be happy to cooperate with any official investigation." "Do not speak to anyone else about what you observed today," Agent Morrison instructed. "Do not discuss your findings with media, other fishermen, or anyone not directly involved in the official investigation. Is that understood?" The instruction felt more like a threat than a request for cooperation. But given the armed security we'd encountered at Echo 7, It was clear that people were willing to use violence to protect whatever was happening at the platform. When we finally docked at a small marina 10 miles east of Grand Isle, we were met by a team of federal agents who immediately secured our boat and began collecting the evidence we'd gathered. The operation was professional and efficient, but it also felt like we were being treated as suspects rather than witnesses to environmental crimes. "We'll need to interview each of you separately," Agent Morrison explained as his team processed our water samples and fish specimens. "This is a matter of national security, and we need to ensure that sensitive information doesn't compromise ongoing investigations." The interviews took place over the next 6 hours, during which each of us was questioned extensively about everything we'd observed at Echo 7. The agents were particularly interested in the water samples Maria had collected and the chemical analysis she'd performed. "These compounds you identified," Agent Morrison said during my interview, "are you certain of their composition?" "Maria's the expert on that," I replied. But she seemed pretty confident about what she'd found. "Dr. Santos has confirmed the presence of synthetic organic compounds that are classified as restricted industrial chemicals," Agent Morrison said. "These chemicals are produced by only a few companies in the United States, and their disposal is strictly regulated by federal law." The revelation that we'd discovered classified chemicals explained the federal involvement and the armed security around Echo 7. We'd stumbled into what appeared to be illegal dumping of materials so sensitive that they required FBI investigation. "Are we in any danger?" I asked, thinking about the armed men who'd ordered us away from the platform. "We're taking steps to ensure your safety," Agent Morrison replied, which wasn't exactly reassuring. "But you need to understand that the people involved in this operation have significant resources and motivation to prevent exposure of their activities." After the interviews, we were released but instructed not to discuss our discovery with anyone outside the immediate investigation team. We were also advised to vary our routines and report any unusual activity or contact from unknown individuals. "This is serious stuff," Tommy said as we drove home from the interview location. "Those FBI guys were scared of something, and that makes me scared too." The next morning, I received a phone call that confirmed Tommy's assessment of the danger we faced. "Captain Sullivan," said an unfamiliar voice, "you and your crew made a mistake yesterday. Smart people would forget about what they think they saw and go back to their normal fishing activities." The caller didn't identify himself, but the threat was clear. Someone with significant resources was willing to intimidate witnesses to prevent disclosure of the Echo 7 operations. "Who is this?" I asked, though the line had already gone dead. I immediately reported the threatening call to Agent Morrison, who arranged for increased security and surveillance of our homes and workplaces. The FBI response confirmed that we discovered something that justified federal protection for witnesses. But the real scope of what we'd uncovered became apparent when Maria received an unexpected visit from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a senior researcher from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. "The chemical compounds you identified at Echo 7 are part of a classified research program," Dr. Reeves explained during a meeting at the FBI field office. "They're experimental agents designed to accelerate the breakdown of organic materials in oil spill cleanup operations." The revelation put our discovery in a completely different context. The chemicals weren't just industrial waste, they were experimental cleanup agents that were apparently being tested in live marine environments without proper authorization or safety protocols. "Are you saying someone's using the Gulf of Mexico as a testing ground for experimental chemicals?" I asked. "That's exactly what we suspect," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "And if these tests are being conducted without proper environmental impact studies, they represent violations of federal law that could result in criminal charges and civil penalties in the hundreds of millions of dollars." The stakes explained everything we'd encountered at Echo 7. The armed security, the FBI involvement, the threats against witnesses, and the apparent government cover-up of the testing program. We discovered evidence of corporate environmental crimes at the highest levels. But we'd also put ourselves in extreme danger by collecting evidence that powerful interests would do anything to suppress. Our decision to ignore old Pierre's warning had made us targets in a conspiracy that reached far beyond abandoned oil platforms and into the highest levels of corporate and government power. The fight to expose the truth about Echo 7 was just beginning, and it would test everything we thought we understood about justice, corporate responsibility, and the price of speaking truth to power. 3 days after our discovery at Echo 7, the situation escalated beyond anything we could have anticipated. What had started as a fishing trip that uncovered environmental violations was becoming a federal case that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power. Agent Morrison contacted me at 6 a.m. with news that changed everything we thought we understood about the Echo 7 operation. "Captain Sullivan, we need you and your crew at the Federal Building immediately," he said. "We've identified the companies involved in the platform operation, and the case has been escalated to the Department of Justice." The urgency in his voice suggested that developments had occurred overnight that significantly increased both the importance of our evidence and the danger we faced as witnesses. When we arrived at the Federal Building, we were briefed on an investigation that involved multiple federal agencies, international corporations, and government officials who had apparently approved illegal chemical testing without proper oversight. Echo 7 is one of 12 platforms being used for unauthorized testing of experimental chemicals, FBI Director Patricia Walsh explained during the briefing. The testing is being conducted by Titan Chemical Industries in partnership with government agencies that exceeded their legal authority. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Instead of a single abandoned platform being used for illegal dumping, we discovered a network of testing sites where experimental chemicals were being released into Gulf waters without environmental impact studies or public notification. "How long has this been going on?" Maria asked, her scientific training helping her understand the environmental implications of widespread chemical testing. "At least 3 years, Director Walsh replied. "And the environmental damage may be irreversible in some areas." The revelation explained old Pierre's warning about Echo 7. As an experienced fisherman who knew Gulf waters intimately, he'd probably noticed changes in fish behavior and marine ecosystem health that indicated something was wrong with the area around the platform. "We need your testimony and evidence to build criminal cases against the companies and government officials involved," Director Walsh continued. "But you need to understand that these people have enormous resources and will use any means necessary to prevent prosecution." The threat assessment was sobering. Titan Chemical Industries was a multi-billion-dollar corporation with political connections at the highest levels of government. The government officials involved in approving the testing program had the authority to classify information and restrict access to evidence that could expose their crimes. "Are we going into witness protection?" Tommy asked, recognizing the implications of testifying against such powerful defendants. "That's being evaluated," Director Walsh replied. "In the meantime, you'll have federal protection and your movements will be restricted for security reasons." The restrictions meant we couldn't return to normal fishing activities, couldn't discuss the case with family members who weren't directly involved, and couldn't travel without FBI approval. Our lives had been completely disrupted by our discovery of the Echo 7 conspiracy. But the personal costs became secondary when we learned the full extent of the environmental damage caused by the illegal chemical testing. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a marine biologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, presented data that showed the testing program had created dead zones in Gulf waters where marine life had been virtually eliminated by toxic chemical exposure. "The chemicals being tested are designed to break down organic materials rapidly," Dr. Martinez explained. "But they don't distinguish between oil spill contaminants and natural marine organisms. They're killing everything they come into contact with." The environmental impact data showed that areas around all 12 testing platforms had experienced massive fish kills, coral reef destruction, and disruption of marine food chains that supported commercial fishing throughout the Gulf. "This is an ecological disaster," Maria said after reviewing the scientific data. "The chemical testing has probably destroyed marine habitats that will take decades to recover. But the human impact was equally devastating. Commercial fishermen throughout the Gulf had been experiencing declining catches without understanding that their fishing grounds were being poisoned by illegal chemical testing. Communities that depended on fishing for their economic survival were being destroyed by corporate crimes they didn't even know were being committed." "How many fishermen have lost their livelihoods because of this testing program?" I asked, thinking about dozens of people I knew whose fishing operations had been struggling in recent years. "Thousands," Director Walsh replied. "And most of them don't know why their catches have declined or their fishing grounds have become unproductive." The revelation made me think about old Pierre's warning in a different context. He hadn't just been protecting his fishing spot, he'd been trying to warn us about dangers that threatened the entire Gulf fishing industry. 4 days after our briefing, the first arrests were made in what the media dubbed Operation Gulf Storm, the federal investigation into illegal chemical testing in Gulf waters. Dr. Richard Blackwood, CEO of Titan Chemical Industries, was arrested at his Houston headquarters on charges of environmental crimes, conspiracy, and fraud. 3 high-ranking officials from the Environmental Protection Agency were arrested for exceeding their authority and approving illegal testing programs. But the arrest triggered a response from the conspiracy that demonstrated just how far they were willing to go to protect their operation. At 2:30 a.m., my house was attacked by unknown assailants who attempted to plant explosive devices that would have killed my entire family. Only the presence of FBI security teams prevented what would have been multiple murders designed to eliminate witnesses to the Echo 7 conspiracy. This was a professional assassination attempt, Agent Morrison told me after the attack was thwarted. These people are willing to commit murder to prevent testimony that could expose their operation. The escalation to attempted murder confirmed that we were dealing with people who viewed witness elimination as an acceptable business strategy. Our discovery of the Echo 7 testing site had put us in the crosshairs of a conspiracy that had billions of dollars and enormous political power at stake. Similar attacks were attempted against Tommy's apartment and Maria's residence, but FBI security prevented any casualties. The coordination of the attacks suggested they were planned and funded by the same organization that was conducting the illegal chemical testing. "We're moving all of you to secure locations," Director Walsh announced after the assassination attempts. "The grand jury proceedings will be expedited, and we'll seek immediate indictments against everyone involved in the conspiracy." The secure location was a federal facility outside Houston where witnesses in major federal cases were protected during grand jury proceedings. Our isolation from normal life was complete, but it was necessary to prevent additional assassination attempts. From the secure facility, we watched as the Echo 7 investigation exploded into national news. Environmental groups demanded immediate cessation of all chemical testing in Gulf waters. Commercial fishing organizations filed class action lawsuits seeking billions of dollars in damages for destroyed fishing grounds. But the most significant development came when congressional investigators announced hearings into the role of federal agencies in approving illegal chemical testing programs. This appears to be a case where government agencies exceeded their legal authority to approve corporate activities that violated multiple federal environmental laws, Congressman David Paterson announced during a press conference. The American people deserve to know how this conspiracy was allowed to operate for years without detection. The congressional hearings would provide a public forum for exposing the full scope of the Echo 7 conspiracy, but they would also create additional risks for witnesses who would be testifying in televised proceedings. "Your testimony will be crucial for both the criminal cases and the congressional investigation," Director Walsh told us during a briefing at the secure facility. "But public testimony will make you permanent targets for anyone connected to the conspiracy." The choice was between remaining in federal protection indefinitely or accepting the risks that came with public testimony that could expose one of the largest environmental conspiracies in American history. "Old Pierre tried to warn us about Echo 7, I said during our discussion of the testimony decision. If we don't testify, his warning was meaningless and the people responsible for destroying Gulf waters will escape justice. The decision to testify publicly was unanimous among our group, despite the personal risks. We discovered evidence of crimes that had devastated marine ecosystems and destroyed fishing communities throughout the Gulf. The truth needed to be told, regardless of the consequences for our own safety. But as we prepared for congressional testimony that would expose the Echo 7 conspiracy to the world, we had no idea that the most dangerous phase of our involvement was still ahead of us. The congressional hearing room was packed with media, environmental activists, and representatives from fishing communities throughout the Gulf Coast when I took the witness stand on October 15th. The hearing was being broadcast live on national television, which meant that our testimony would reach millions of people, including those who wanted to silence us permanently. "Captain Sullivan," Congressman Paterson began, "please tell the committee what you observed at Platform Echo 7 on July 18th. For the next 2 hours, I described our discovery of the chemical contamination, the dead fish, the armed security that had ordered us away from the platform, and the subsequent FBI investigation that had revealed the scope of the illegal testing program. In your professional opinion as a charter boat captain with 22 years of experience in Gulf waters, was the contamination you observed at Echo 7 consistent with normal oil platform operations?" Congressman Paterson asked. "Absolutely not," I replied. "Normal platform operations don't produce the kind of chemical contamination we found, and they certainly don't require armed security to keep fishermen away from abandoned platforms." Maria's testimony was particularly damaging to the defendants. Her scientific analysis of the water samples provided definitive proof that experimental chemicals were being dumped into Gulf waters without proper authorization or environmental impact studies. "The chemical compounds I identified are not produced by any routine oil refining process," Maria testified. "They are experimental agents designed for specific industrial applications, and their release into marine environments violates multiple federal environmental protection laws. Tommy's testimony focused on the impact of the chemical testing on local fishing communities, many of which had been struggling with declining catches without understanding that their fishing grounds were being poisoned. "My family's been fishing these waters for 4 generations, Tommy told the committee. "We've seen our catches decline over the past 3 years, and we didn't know why until we discovered what was happening at Echo 7 and the other testing platforms." But the most explosive testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the NIES researcher who had been investigating the health effects of the experimental chemicals. "The chemicals being tested in Gulf waters are known to cause cancer, reproductive disorders, and neurological damage in humans," Dr. Reeves testified. "The companies conducting these tests knew about the health risks but proceeded with the program anyway because they believed the testing sites were remote enough to avoid detection." The health impact revelation added a new dimension to the conspiracy. Not only had the testing program destroyed marine ecosystems and fishing communities, but it had also exposed Gulf Coast residents to cancer-causing chemicals without their knowledge or consent. "How many people may have been exposed to these chemicals?" Congressman Patterson asked. "Potentially millions," Dr. Reeves replied. "The chemicals are persistent in the environment and can be transported by ocean currents, atmospheric circulation, and the food chain. Anyone who eats Gulf seafood or swims in Gulf waters in the affected areas may have been exposed." The revelation that millions of people had been unknowingly exposed to cancer-causing chemicals triggered immediate demands for criminal prosecutions and civil remedies that could result in billions of dollars in damages. But the congressional testimony also triggered a response from the conspiracy that demonstrated they were still willing to use violence to protect their interests. On the second day of hearings, Dr. Margaret Foster, a marine biologist who had been scheduled to testify about the environmental impact of the testing program, was killed in a car accident that investigators immediately recognized as sabotage. Dr. Foster's vehicle was tampered with, Agent Morrison told us during an emergency security briefing. Her death was designed to intimidate other witnesses and send a message that testimony against the conspiracy carries fatal consequences. The murder of Dr. Foster escalated the investigation to a new level. The FBI announced that they were treating the case as domestic terrorism, and federal prosecutors indicated they would seek the death penalty for anyone involved in ordering witness assassinations. "These people have declared war on the American justice system," U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh announced during a press conference. "We will use every resource at our disposal to ensure that they face the full consequences of their crimes." But the murder also demonstrated that our testimony had been effective in exposing the conspiracy. The defendants were desperate enough to commit murder in attempts to prevent additional revelations about the extent of their criminal enterprise. 3 days after Dr. Foster's murder, federal agents raided Titan Chemical Industries headquarters and seized documents that revealed the full scope of the illegal testing program. The documents show that Titan Chemical knew their testing would cause massive environmental damage, FBI Director Walsh announced. They proceeded with the program anyway because they calculated that the potential profits exceeded the likely penalties for environmental violations. The seized documents also revealed that government officials had been bribed to approve the testing program and that elected officials had received campaign contributions in exchange for blocking environmental oversight of the platform operations. "This is corruption at the highest levels of government and industry," Congressman Patterson said after reviewing the seized documents. "The American people have been betrayed by officials who were supposed to protect them from exactly this kind of environmental disaster." The document revelations triggered additional arrests and indictments that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power. But they also intensified the threats against witnesses who had made these prosecutions possible. "We're recommending permanent relocation and new identities for all witnesses," Agent Morrison told us during another security briefing. "The conspiracy involves people with enough resources and connections to pose a permanent threat to your safety." The prospect of entering witness protection permanently was devastating. It meant giving up our homes, our careers, our connections to the communities where we'd lived our entire lives. But it also meant staying alive to see justice done for the environmental crimes we'd helped expose. "What about our families?" Tommy asked, thinking about his wife and children who would also have to disappear into federal protection. "Everyone connected to the witnesses will be relocated," Agent Morrison confirmed. "This is a national security matter now, and protecting witnesses is essential for the success of the prosecutions." The decision to enter permanent witness protection was the most difficult choice any of us had ever faced. But the alternative was living in constant fear of assassination attempts from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their conspiracy. 6 months after our testimony, federal prosecutors announced indictments against 47 individuals and 12 corporations involved in the Echo 7 conspiracy. The charges included environmental crimes, fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and murder in connection with Dr. Foster's assassination. This is the largest environmental crimes prosecution in American history, U.S. Attorney Walsh announced. The defendants face potential sentences ranging from decades in prison to the death penalty for the most serious charges. But the legal victory came at an enormous personal cost. We were living under assumed names in a small town in Montana, completely disconnected from the Gulf Coast communities where we'd spent our entire lives. Our old identities were legally dead, and we could never return to the lives we'd known before our discovery at Echo 7. Do you regret ignoring old Pierre's warning? Maria asked during one of our conversations about the choices that had led us to our current situation. No, I replied honestly. Pierre was trying to protect us, but what we discovered needed to be exposed. Millions of people were being poisoned, and the Gulf was being destroyed. Someone had to speak up. The trials began 18 months after our congressional testimony, with federal prosecutors presenting evidence that painted a picture of corporate greed and government corruption that shocked even experienced observers of white-collar crime. The evidence showed that Titan Chemical Industries had lobbied for changes in environmental regulations that would allow experimental chemical testing in marine environments. When their lobbying efforts failed, they had bribed government officials to approve the testing without proper environmental reviews. The defendants viewed the Gulf of Mexico as a convenient dumping ground for toxic chemicals that they couldn't dispose of legally, Prosecutor David Martinez told the jury during opening statements. They calculated that the remote location of the testing sites would prevent detection of their crimes. But the most damning evidence came from internal company documents that showed corporate executives discussing the environmental and health consequences of their testing program with full knowledge of the damage it would cause. If this kills a few fish and makes some fishermen sick, that's an acceptable cost of doing business, read one email from Titan Chemical CEO Richard Blackwood. The profits from successful chemical development will more than offset any environmental penalties. The email became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, demonstrating that the environmental destruction was not an unintended consequence of legitimate research, but a calculated decision to prioritize profits over public health and environmental protection. Tommy's testimony about the impact on fishing communities was particularly effective with the jury, many of whom came from rural areas where they understood the importance of natural resources to local economies. My family's been fishing these waters for 4 generations, Tommy testified. We've seen our catches decline over the past 3 years, and we didn't know why until we discovered what was happening at Echo 7 and the other testing platforms. The emotional impact of Tommy's testimony was evident in the jury's reaction, and several jurors were visibly upset when he described how fishing families had been forced to abandon livelihoods that had supported them for generations. Maria's scientific testimony provided the technical foundation for the criminal charges, explaining how the experimental chemicals worked and why their release into marine environments constituted such serious environmental crimes. These chemicals were designed to break down organic materials, which means they attack the foundation of marine food chains, Maria explained to the jury. The defendants knew this would happen, but they released the chemicals anyway because remote testing locations made detection unlikely. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the testing was conducted under government authorization and that their clients had relied on official approval for their activities. But the evidence showed that government officials had been bribed to provide that authorization and had exceeded their legal authority in approving the testing program. The defendants didn't rely on government authorization, Prosecutor Martinez argued during closing statements. They purchased that authorization through bribes and illegal campaign contributions, then used it as cover for environmental crimes they knew would cause massive damage. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against the corporate defendants. The government officials who had been bribed received similar convictions, and the individuals involved in ordering Dr. Foster's assassination were convicted of first-degree murder. Justice has been served for the victims of this environmental conspiracy, U.S. Attorney Walsh announced after the verdicts were delivered. The defendants will spend the rest of their lives in prison, and the companies involved will pay billions of dollars in restitution to affected communities. But while the legal victory was complete, the personal cost of achieving it remained enormous. We were still living under assumed identities, still separated from our families and communities, still unable to return to the lives we'd known before our discovery at Echo 7. The restitution payments to Gulf Coast communities provided some compensation for the environmental damage, but they couldn't restore the marine ecosystems that had been destroyed or bring back Dr. Foster and the other people who had died because of the conspiracy. 2 years after the trials concluded, I received an unexpected visit from old Pierre Thibodeau, who had somehow managed to track us down despite our federal protection and new identities. "I heard what you boys did," Pierre said during our brief meeting at a restaurant in our Montana town. "You did right even though it cost you everything." Pierre explained that he'd been watching Echo 7 for months before our encounter, documenting the environmental changes and trying to warn other fishermen about the dangers around the platform. "I knew something terrible was happening there," Pierre said. "But I didn't know how terrible until your testimony showed what they was really doing." Pierre's visit provided closure that I hadn't expected. The old fisherman who had tried to warn us away from Echo 7 had become an ally in the fight to expose the truth about the environmental conspiracy. "The Gulf is starting to heal," Pierre reported. "Fish are coming back to some of the areas that was poisoned. It's going to take years, maybe decades, but the water's getting cleaner." The news that marine ecosystems were beginning to recover provided some justification for the sacrifices we'd made to expose the conspiracy. Our testimony had not only resulted in criminal convictions and financial penalties, but it had also stopped the illegal chemical testing that was destroying Gulf waters. But the conversation with Pierre also reminded me of the life I'd lost by ignoring his original warning. The charter fishing business I'd built over 22 years was gone forever, along with the relationships and community connections that had defined my adult life. "Do you ever wish you'd listened to me that day?" Pierre asked as our meeting concluded. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But if we hadn't discovered what was happening at Echo 7, the testing would have continued and the damage would have been much worse." Pierre nodded, understanding the complex mixture of regret and satisfaction that came with having done the right thing at enormous personal cost. 5 years after our discovery at Echo 7, I stood on the shores of Flathead Lake in Montana, watching the sunrise over water that was cleaner and safer than the Gulf waters I'd called home for most of my adult life. Our new identities had become our real identities, and the small fishing guide business I'd built in Montana had replaced the charter fishing operation I'd lost in Louisiana. But every morning when I looked out over the lake, I thought about the Gulf Coast communities that were still recovering from the environmental disaster we'd helped expose, and about the price that speaking truth to power had demanded from everyone involved. The legal aftermath of the Echo 7 trials had continued for years after the criminal convictions. Civil lawsuits filed by affected communities had resulted in settlements totaling over $12 billion, making it the largest environmental damages award in American history. The money couldn't restore destroyed marine ecosystems overnight, but it had funded cleanup efforts, fishing industry recovery programs, and health monitoring for people who had been exposed to the experimental chemicals. "The Gulf is healing faster than we expected," Dr. Sarah Martinez, the marine biologist who had replaced Maria as lead scientist on the recovery project, told me during one of our phone conversations. "The marine life is recovering, and commercial fishing is returning to some of the areas that were most severely damaged. But the recovery was incomplete and uneven. Some areas around the former testing platforms remained largely sterile, their ecosystems so thoroughly disrupted that natural recovery might take decades. The human health consequences of chemical exposure were still being studied, with cancer rates in affected communities remaining higher than normal. Tommy had adapted to our new life in Montana better than anyone had expected. His family had relocated with him, and he'd found work as a fishing guide on the same lake where I operated my business. The skills he'd learned on Gulf waters translated well to freshwater fishing, and his easygoing personality made him popular with tourists. "It's different, but it's still fishing," Tommy said during one of our conversations about our changed lives. "And I don't have to worry about my kids being poisoned by the water." Maria had used her federal protection to pursue a Ph.D. in environmental toxicology, becoming an expert on the long-term effects of industrial chemical pollution in marine environments. Her research was funded by the restitution payments from the Echo 7 case, and she'd become a nationally recognized authority on environmental crimes. "The Echo 7 case changed how we investigate environmental violations," Maria explained during one of her visits to Montana. "Federal agencies now have protocols for detecting illegal chemical testing and procedures for protecting witnesses who report environmental crimes." The procedural changes had already resulted in the discovery and prosecution of other illegal testing programs, demonstrating that Echo 7 had been part of a broader pattern of corporate environmental crimes that had been hidden from public scrutiny. but the personal costs of our involvement remained significant. We could never return to our former lives, never reconnect with the communities where we'd grown up, never resume the relationships and careers that had been interrupted by our discovery of the conspiracy. The isolation was particularly difficult during major life events. When my daughter graduated from college, I couldn't attend the ceremony because it would have required revealing our location to extended family members who weren't in federal protection. When Tommy's father died, he couldn't attend the funeral for the same security reasons. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it, Tommy admitted during one of our discussions about the sacrifices we'd made. We stopped the chemical testing, but we lost everything else. The question of whether our sacrifices had been justified was one that all of us struggled with, especially during moments when the isolation and loss felt overwhelming. But the answer usually came from unexpected sources, like the letter I received from a young fisherman in Louisiana whose family had been able to return to fishing because of the environmental cleanup funded by the Echo 7 settlements. My grandfather lost his fishing business because of what those companies did to our waters, the young man wrote. But because of what you and your crew did, I'm able to fish the same waters he did. My children will be able to fish there too. Letters like that one reminded me that our discovery had prevented an environmental disaster from becoming even worse, and that the sacrifices we'd made had protected future generations of Gulf Coast residents from continued chemical poisoning. 7 years after the trials, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the Echo 7 conspiracy and its aftermath. The documentary would require revealing our current identities and locations, effectively ending our federal protection and exposing us to potential retaliation from anyone still connected to the original conspiracy. Most of the main conspirators are in prison or dead, Agent Morrison, now retired from the FBI, told me during a security consultation about the documentary. But some of the financial backers are still free, and they might view the documentary as a threat to their remaining interests. The decision about whether to participate in the documentary was complicated by the same risk-benefit analysis that had characterized every major choice we'd made since discovering Echo 7. Speaking publicly about our experience could help prevent similar environmental crimes, but it would also make us visible targets for anyone seeking revenge. The statute of limitations on most of the charges has expired, Agent Morrison continued. And the documentary could serve the public interest by educating people about environmental crimes and corporate corruption. After extensive discussions with Maria and Tommy, we decided to participate in the documentary. Our story needed to be told, not just as a record of the Echo 7 conspiracy, but as an example of how ordinary citizens could hold powerful corporations accountable for environmental crimes. The documentary, titled Dead Waters: The Echo 7 Conspiracy, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later broadcast nationally on PBS. The film combined our testimony with scientific evidence, congressional hearing footage, and interviews with affected community members to create a comprehensive account of the environmental conspiracy and its consequences. This documentary shows how corporate greed and government corruption can devastate entire ecosystems, the PBS introduction stated. But it also demonstrates how citizen witnesses can expose environmental crimes and achieve justice for affected communities. The public response to the documentary was overwhelmingly positive, with environmental groups using it as an educational tool and law enforcement agencies incorporating it into training programs for investigating environmental crimes. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from old Pierre Thibodeau, who contacted me after the documentary aired to share his thoughts on how the Echo 7 story had concluded. "You boys did something I couldn't do," Pierre said during our phone conversation. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fight people with that much power and money. You found a way to make them pay for what they did." Pierre reported that Gulf fishing had largely recovered in the areas that hadn't been permanently damaged by the chemical testing. His own fishing business was thriving again, and he was teaching his grandson the traditional methods that had sustained Cajun fishing families for generations. "The water's clean again," Pierre said. "My grandson will be able to fish the same waters I did, the same waters my grandfather did. That's thanks to what you folks sacrificed to stop those people." 10 years after our discovery at Echo 7, I received the ultimate validation that our sacrifices had been justified. An invitation to speak at the graduation ceremony of the first class of environmental enforcement officers trained under the new federal protocols that had been developed in response to the Echo 7 case. "Your courage in exposing the Echo 7 conspiracy has directly contributed to the development of new approaches to environmental law enforcement," the graduation ceremony program stated. The procedures and protocols inspired by your case have already prevented similar environmental crimes and protected countless communities from corporate environmental predators. The ceremony was held in New Orleans, the first time I'd returned to Louisiana since entering federal protection 10 years earlier. Walking through the city where the FBI investigation had begun, I was struck by how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The Gulf waters were cleaner than they'd been during the chemical testing period, but they would never fully recover from the damage that had been done. The fishing communities had rebuilt their economies with help from the settlement money, but they would always remember the years when their traditional livelihoods had been threatened by corporate environmental crimes. The Echo 7 case proved that environmental crimes can be prosecuted successfully when witnesses are willing to testify despite personal risks, I told the graduating environmental officers. But it also proved that preventing environmental crimes is better than prosecuting them after the damage has been done. The speech was the first time I'd spoken publicly about the Echo 7 case without federal protection, and it felt like the final chapter in a story that had begun with old Pierre's warning about staying away from platform Echo 7. He had told us not to go near that platform. When we did, something happened none of us expected. We discovered an environmental conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power, and we found the courage to expose it despite the enormous personal cost. The experience had taught us that ordinary citizens have the power to hold powerful institutions accountable for their crimes, but that exercising that power requires sacrifices that can change your life forever. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you thought was important. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you discover that protecting something bigger than yourself can give your life a meaning that personal success never could. In the end, we traded our old lives for the knowledge that we'd helped protect the Gulf of Mexico for future generations. It was a trade that had cost us everything we'd once valued, but it was also a trade that had given us something we'd never expected: the satisfaction of knowing that we'd made a difference when it mattered most. 15 years after our discovery at Echo 7, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. The University of New Orleans was establishing the Pierre Thibodeau Environmental Protection Center, named for the old Cajun fisherman who had tried to warn us away from the platform and later became an advocate for environmental monitoring throughout the Gulf. Pierre had died 2 years earlier at age 85, still fishing the waters he'd protected for most of his life. His family had donated his extensive records of Gulf water conditions to the university, creating a database that helped scientists understand how the marine ecosystem had changed over decades of industrial development. Papa always said that fishermen were the first to know when something was wrong with the water, Pierre's grandson, Michel Thibodeau, told me during the dedication ceremony. But he also said that knowing wasn't enough if you couldn't do anything about it. The Environmental Center would train the next generation of marine scientists and environmental enforcement officers, ensuring that future environmental crimes would be detected and prosecuted before they could cause the kind of damage we discovered at Echo 7. But the ceremony also served as an opportunity to assess the long-term impact of our decision to ignore Pierre's warning and investigate the abandoned platform. Dr. Maria Santos, now Dr. Maria Santos Williams after marrying a Montana wildlife biologist, had become the center's first director. Her research on the Echo 7 chemicals had led to breakthrough discoveries about environmental toxicology that were being used to develop safer industrial processes worldwide. The chemicals we discovered at Echo 7 were just the beginning, Maria explained during her presentation at the dedication ceremony. Our research has identified dozens of other toxic compounds that are being released into marine environments without proper testing or regulation. Tommy had used his portion of the Witness Compensation Fund to establish a fishing guide training program for young people from Louisiana fishing families who wanted to learn sustainable fishing practices. The program had trained over 200 guides who were now working throughout the Gulf Coast region. We couldn't save the old way of fishing, Tommy said during his remarks at the ceremony, but we helped create new ways that respect the environment and protect it for future generations. The legal precedents established by the Echo 7 prosecutions had been used in dozens of subsequent environmental cases, resulting in billions of dollars in additional penalties and cleanup costs for companies that violated environmental laws. The Echo 7 case changed the calculation for potential environmental criminals, Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, now a federal judge, explained during a panel discussion at the ceremony. Companies now understand that environmental crimes will be prosecuted aggressively and that witnesses will be protected effectively. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the network of environmental monitoring stations that had been established throughout the Gulf using funding from the Echo 7 settlements. The monitoring system provided real-time data on water quality, marine life health, and chemical contamination that made it virtually impossible for future conspiracies to operate undetected. We now have the capability to detect environmental crimes within days or weeks of their commission, explained Dr. Robert Anderson, director of the Gulf Environmental Monitoring Network. The kind of long-term contamination that occurred at Echo 7 couldn't happen today without immediate detection and response. During the ceremony, I was surprised to be presented with an award from the Environmental Protection Agency recognizing civilian contributions to environmental protection. The award was particularly meaningful because it came from the same agency whose officials had been corrupted by the original Echo 7 conspiracy. The courage demonstrated by Captain Sullivan and his crew represents the best of American civic responsibility, EPA Administrator Patricia Rodriguez said during the presentation. Their willingness to speak truth to power, despite enormous personal costs, prevented an environmental disaster from becoming even worse and established legal precedents that continue to protect communities throughout the United States. But the most moving moment of the ceremony came when Kevin Williams, the teenage son of our clients who had been with us during the original discovery, spoke about how the experience had shaped his career choice. Now Dr. Kevin Williams, a marine biologist specializing in environmental remediation, Kevin had spent his career developing new techniques for cleaning up chemical contamination in marine environments. That day on Captain Sullivan's boat, when we pulled that dead fish from the contaminated water around Echo 7, I knew I wanted to spend my life protecting marine ecosystems, Kevin said during his presentation. The courage I saw from the crew that day taught me that scientists have a responsibility to speak up when they discover evidence of environmental crimes. Kevin's research had led to the development of new bioremediation techniques that were being used to accelerate the recovery of contaminated marine areas throughout the Gulf. His work was funded by grants from the Echo 7 Settlement Fund, creating a direct connection between our discovery and ongoing efforts to heal the damage that had been done. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial to the victims of the Echo 7 conspiracy, the marine life that had been killed by chemical contamination, the fishing families whose livelihoods had been destroyed, and Dr. Margaret Foster, the marine biologist who had been murdered for her willingness to testify about the environmental crimes. These victims will not be forgotten, the memorial inscription read. Their sacrifice reminds us that environmental protection requires constant vigilance and the courage to confront powerful interests that prioritize profits over public health and environmental safety. As I stood before the memorial, I thought about the chain of events that had begun with old Pierre's warning and led to this moment of recognition and remembrance. A simple decision to investigate an abandoned oil platform had revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate and government power, and had ultimately resulted in legal, scientific, and social changes that would protect the environment for generations. But I also thought about the costs of that discovery, the lives lost, the families displaced, the careers ended, and the communities damaged by both the original crimes and the process of exposing them. The balance between those costs and benefits would always be complicated, but standing in a ceremony dedicated to preventing future environmental crimes, surrounded by scientists, enforcement officers, and community members who were committed to protecting the Gulf of Mexico, I knew that our sacrifices had been justified. Old Pierre had told us not to go near that platform. When we did, something happened that none of us expected. We discovered that ordinary citizens have the power to hold powerful institutions accountable for their crimes, even when exercising that power requires sacrificing everything they value. The lesson of Echo 7 wasn't just about environmental protection or corporate accountability. It was about the responsibility that comes with knowledge and the courage required to act on that knowledge when action demands enormous personal sacrifice. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. But sometimes, if you're fortunate, the hardest thing turns out to be the most important thing you ever did. The waters around Echo 7 were clean again, the platform had been properly decommissioned, and the marine life was returning. The Gulf would never be exactly what it had been before the chemical testing, but it was healing, and it was protected by laws and monitoring systems that would prevent similar crimes. That was worth everything we'd given up to achieve it.